For most observers of American politics, deregulation is synonymous with the rise of modern conservatism, particularly the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Throughout that presidential campaign, Reagan had promised to get government off our backs and had trumpeted deregulation of business as a centerpiece of his reform agenda. His victory had seemed to usher in a new era of leadership and ideology, a new morning in America that broke sharply from the economic policies that had reigned triumphant since the New Deal. This sense of historical rupture was captured in Reagan's inaugural address, which he famously declared that, quote, "In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." In the weeks that followed, Reagan suspended a large number of, quote, "midnight regulations" announced by the prior administration in its final days, issued Executive Order 12-291, which required that all new regulations pass a cost-benefit test, and increased the authority of the White House Office of Management and Budget to oversee regulatory proposals. He set up a presidential task force on regulatory relief directed by Vice President George H.W. Bush to identify existing burdensome regulations that could be eliminated. And his top-level appointments reflected the president's antipathy toward regulation. Murray Weidenbaum, the nation's most prominent critic of regulatory costs, chaired the Council of Economic Advisors. Thorne Auchter, a businessman whose construction firm received 48 citations for workplace safety violations, became the Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Assistant Secretary of Labor for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Anti-environmentalist Anne Garush-Furford directed the Environmental Protection Agency. And the impact of these appointments were quickly felt. By 1983, the EPA had cut back its enforcement actions by 84% and its legal filings by 78%. During Reagan's final term, overall regulatory agency budgets had declined by 8% and staffing levels by 10%. Yet neither Reagan's rhetoric or policies corroborate the revolutionary departure for which he is remembered. 3 years before Reagan's inaugural condemnation of government, Jimmy Carter's 1978 State of the Union address had already acknowledged that, quote, "We need to realize that there is a limit to the role and the function of government. Government cannot solve our problems. It can't set our goals. It cannot define our vision. Government cannot eliminate poverty or provide a bountiful economy, or reduce inflation, or save our cities, or cure illiteracy, or provide energy. Those of us who can govern can sometimes inspire. We can identify needs and marshal resources. We simply cannot be the managers of everybody and everything." Carter's speech was nothing short of a comprehensive repudiation of New Deal liberalism. But Carter's speech had been largely forgotten, while Reagan's rather similar remarks 3 years later reverberated through the American political imagination. It's clear that Carter lacked Reagan's legendary rhetorical talent. Reagan offered a pithy and straightforward analysis of the numerous difficulties facing the nation's economy, from sustained inflation, industrial unemployment, heavy taxes, and rising budget deficits. Implicit in this diagnosis was a simple prescription. If government caused a problem, restraining government would solve it. On the other hand, Carter's rambling delivery reflected his mixed feelings about the place of government in modern American life. Although weighed by a heavy sense of responsibility, he could only feebly affirm government's role in inspiring, identifying needs, and marshaling resources. This paled with its clear limitations. 3 years before Reagan's famous dictum, Carter unconditionally acknowledged that government could not solve the nation's pressing challenges. The major difference between the remarks was tonal rather than substantive. Carter's hesitancy, frustration, and disappointment contrasted strikingly with Reagan's eager, expansive, and guilt-free anti-statism. Yet their conclusions were virtually indistinguishable. Indeed, Carter's presidency was marked by a consistent distrust of traditional New Deal liberalism. Like Reagan, Carter had run for office in 1976 as an outsider who would clean up Washington. While others of Carter's contemporaries would exaggerate their connections to Franklin Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy, Carter boasted on the campaign trail that he had never met a Democratic president. His strident anti-establishment rhetoric prompted liberal hero and campaign rival Hubert Humphrey to warn that candidates who make an attack on Washington are making an attack on government programs, on blacks, on minorities, on cities. It's a disguised new form of racism, a disguised new form of conservatism. Carter's advisors encouraged his search for a post-New Deal form of politics. In December 1976, campaign pollster Patrick Cadell wrote the president-elect a lengthy memo forecasting a long-term decline in electoral partisanship that Carter was uniquely positioned to exploit. Being neither a traditional liberal nor a conservative, he argued that Carter could spark a political realignment, ushering in a fundamentally new ideology that would attract large numbers of voters to the Democrats. Several months earlier, Charles Schultz, an economist at the Brookings Institution and former budget director for Lyndon Johnson, wrote a letter to the campaign staff in which he cautioned Carter to avoid close identification with economic populism. Quote, "Unlike Democratic liberals of the knee-jerk variety who tend to be for almost any new government intervention which promises to attack some imperfection, Schultz believes that, quote, we should conserve regulation for critical cases. Promise to regulate or otherwise intervene in new ways, therefore, have to be very carefully and sparingly selected from a long list of do-good suggestions." Schultz considered his letter a plea to emphasize the attitude which had characterized the Jimmy Carter campaign to date: select, discriminate, avoid the old-fashioned liberal conservative reflexes. He insisted that this is not a conservative message. Indeed, the new liberalism can perhaps be defined as compassionate, selective, and therefore effective use of government power toward ends and through means which are ultimately subject to the democratic political process. Once in office, Carter embraced regulatory restraint. He appointed Schultz to chair the Council of Economic Advisors and created two bodies to control regulatory growth: an interagency regulatory analysis and review group to identify and debate those rules proposed within the executive branch that would significantly impact American industry, and a broader regulatory council that encouraged agencies to coordinate policies in particular areas of industry. Carter also issued Executive Order 12044, which required economic impact analyses for all significant new regulations in the executive branch. While these efforts did little to shrink agency budgets, they clearly carved the path Reagan would follow. Carter's legislative achievements, moreover, far exceeded his successor. Whereas Reagan signed into law savings and loan and cable television deregulation, Carter oversaw the deregulation of airlines, trucking, railroads, natural gas, electricity, commercial banks and thrifts, and telecommunications. Carter signed two 1980 laws to ease regulatory burdens on small businesses. One of them, the Regulatory Flexibility Act, established within the White House Office of Management and Budget the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, an institutional bottleneck Reagan used to effectively discourage agencies from proposing new regulations. Economic deregulation meant different things to Carter and to Reagan, even if its practical effects were much the same. For instance, in remarks to the Consumer Federation of America in 1980, Carter portrayed economic deregulation as a consumer initiative, a challenge to the cartels, the little OPECs that keep prices high to keep competition out. He boasted that airline deregulation revolutionized air transportation and produced $2.5 billion in savings for consumers. He promised that trucking deregulation would save billions of dollars more. In this light, the main achievement of deregulation lay in providing lower travel fares and cheaper goods. The virtue of a competitive marketplace was not the freedom that it provides to private business, as Reagan would have it, but rather its power to discipline corporations that would prefer to use government protection to gouge consumers and boost profits.